Hello, my name is Mariah Patty, and if you are new to this channel, I make videos about both sewing and world building. And this video is about my recreation of the 1789 Strapless Stitched Stays from Patterns of Fashion 5. For this project, I want to use as many historically accurate stay making techniques as I am currently capable. I have technically made a pair of stays before, but they hardly count. I made them in high school to wear to Renaissance fairs, just directly following the pattern I thought looked coolest, with zero knowledge of 18th century or corsetry. They are made from polyester brocade, lined in muslin, and interlined with nothing but youthful ambition. I've been saying 2019 is the year I will finally make a real pair of 18th century stays, and this project has become an absolute case study for Parkinson's law. And now it is mid-November, and if I want to get these stays done before the year is out, it is time to get this project moving. Okay, so first the pattern. I'm planning to make the stays directly from the book pattern, only adjusting them minimally for fit. The pattern is already gridded in a very handy 1/4 inch to 1 inch ratio, so if I scan it in and enlarge it by 4, it should print perfectly. There's nothing wrong with drawing out a grid and copying it by hand, but if you have the equipment, I find this method to be faster and more reassuringly precise.
So I think the first step to do is I'm going to make a full mock-up. I bought some green canvas and I'm just going to do one layer and bone it as well as I can.
Okay, one quick and dirty mock-up of the stays. I can tell that it fits me pretty well. So basically everything I make I have to take 1 inch out of the waist because as you can see all of these splits are beginning on top of my hip instead of at the base of the waist where they should be. So if I take about 1 inch out of the 4 pattern pieces, the 2 tips of it are too far in. I think they need to be a little bit further to the side. Anyways. So yeah, I guess I need to, I probably do need to do a round 2. Okay, it'll be worth it.
Well, I hope I didn't just royally screw it up. I used the grid to find the exact same point in the waist on each piece, and then I took out 1 inch using the grid and taped it back together. And then I cut off the strip along the top here using the grid and moved it down by 1 inch to widen the top point. So I think I need to take all of these pieces, trace them out on fresh paper, and then kind of even out and smooth over these lines now that none of them match up with each other. I'm going to have to completely create new boning channels myself because I don't think I can use this. So I'll have to basically use the original pattern as a guide and then make it up.
Okay, so I did not bone this one as heavily, but I really needed to.
You can see that just taking 1 inch out of the waist made a massive difference in the fit. It now, like, accurately splays out across my hips, and it closes almost all the way. So just being able to more accurately proportion it to the length of my torso made it just fit overall almost perfectly. So the fabrics I'm going to be using for this project are all right here. This is going to be the cover fabric. This is Madder Red Lightweight Linen from Burnley and Trowbridge. I was not able to find the correct shade of light brown linen in the right linen twill, so I just went with something that I liked, even though it's not technically thick enough. So what I'm probably going to do for strength and opacity, I'm going to double up the Madder Red for an outer layer. And then I have this linen canvas. I have a medium weight natural linen, and then I have a lightweight linen that I will probably use for the lining. I'm under the impression that 18th century buckram is very different from modern millinery buckram, so for this project I'm going to find out for myself by making it, using a video tutorial by Burnley and Trowbridge. You just need gum tragacanth and you paint it on. Very simple. I tried a couple of strategies for this. At first I was planning to paint an entire length of linen, but then I realized that this was going to be a massive waste of time and gum, so I decided to trace my pattern pieces to the linen and only paint inside the lines. I traced them with a water-soluble marker, and then I realized that that was dumb as the lines began to disappear when I painted the gum on. And I also realized that it was an inner lining anyways and would never be seen, so I remarked the pieces with just a regular ink pen. Okay, so I finished painting on the first layer of gum tragacanth, whatever it is.
Tragacanth.
It is worth noting that even just a single layer took about 1/3 of my jar. So I will wait until they're dry and see how thick they are before I decide whether or not I'm going to do a second layer. Okay, so the glue has pretty much dried at this point, and it has quite distinctively stiffened the pieces, but I am going to go ahead and give it one more layer to see how much more stiff it gets. Once the second coat of gum tragacanth dried, the pieces were ready to separate. I cut them with a generous seam allowance, leaving plenty of excess to trim down later, because I know they'll fray in the meantime. Then I traced the pieces of buckram to cut out the layer of linen canvas and the 2 layers of madder cover fabric. Next, the layers need to be basted together, but first, an ironing job. The 4 layers will be stacked with the 2 cover layers first, then the canvas inner lining, then the buckram inner lining last, with my pen markings facing up. I pinned them together, and it's amazing how much body each piece already has just from stacking the layers. Once all of the pieces have been layered and pinned together, I'm going to baste them by hand. Basting is a great opportunity to use up cheap junk thread, as I'll end up taking out the stitches later anyways. Yesterday I finished basting them all together. The next step will be to trace on where some of the boning channel placement should be. And as you can see, all of the edits that I made to my original pattern that I printed out have made it pretty much useless for tracing. So I'm gonna have to find the placement for the edges of the boning and then just fill in through measurements in between. I'm going to attempt to sew with this linen thread on a normal sewing machine. When you're sewing by hand with linen thread, you need to wax it because it experiences a lot of friction and it can start to fray. I'm hoping that if it's just on a normal sewing machine, the friction won't be as high and it will be okay without the waxing. So yeah, this is an experiment. I'll let you know.
Okay, time for the boning channels. It is on my bucket list to completely hand sew a pair of stays one day.
But it is not this day.
I don't think it would be the best investment of my time right now, given the fact that this is my first pair of stays that I'm actually trying to fit to myself and the very high likelihood that I'm going to screw something up.
Okay, the channels are all finished except for one final back piece. This piece needs to be done a bit differently. Starting from the center back, I marked out a 1/4 inch wide channel. Then I marked out a second channel 1/2 inch over from that. The 1/2 inch in the middle will not be boned. That is where the eyelets will go. The 1/4 inch at the center back will be boned, but differently. I can start from the 1/2 inch line and stitch the rest of the channels like usual. Then I'll fold the whole edge over along the basting stitch and pin the fold down. I did have to redo the stitching a couple of times before I figured out a method, because the channel kept ending up too tight for the boning. I first used a long stitch to baste down the center of the eyelet strip. Then I inserted the boning. Thicker plastic boning for the center back piece. Once the boning was in, I shoved it against the fold and switched my machine to a zipper foot so I could sew right up against the edge of the bone. Then I just seam ripped out that basting stitch. Yay! All of the boning channels are ready to go. Time to start all of the boning. There are 138 boning channels, and I know this because I would apparently rather sit here and count them than actually start boning them. As whalebone has become rather inaccessible, I will be boning my stays with this 3/16 inch half oval Reid which I got online from Joann's. I've read that Reid can be fiddly and brittle to insert, and indeed the first one I tried to slide in just snapped. So I think soaking the whole bundle is a good place to start.
One piece done. That took a while, and this was the easiest piece. I don't know if I will ever work with Reid boning again.
I did finally figure out how to insert the Reid. It was a lot harder than I expected, and I don't know if other people know a better method, but this is what worked for me. I tried tying the Reid to a long doll needle yesterday, and that was a start, but the string or the Reid kept breaking. For one, I drained the water and let the reeds dry overnight. They are still damp, but not sopping. When they get wet, they don't slide through the channels well, and they buckle under the slightest pressure, so letting them dry a bit overnight seemed like the right balance. The doll needle was a good start, but it wasn't long enough. I used a strip of baling wire with a bend in one end to pass the thread through. I used a thick, sturdy buttonhole thread to pull the bones through. Just poking a hole through the bone for the thread didn't work. The bones are soft when wet, too soft. The thread breaks right through them, so I had to sew the thread through a couple of times and wrap it around the bones to give it the right combination of tension. I also passed a thicker plastic bone through the channel first to stretch it out a bit. The Reid went in much better that way. Some of the reeds I cut to the correct shape of the channel, some I left a bit overlong because I'm still not sure where the final cut will go before I bind the edges. Once I had a system, I was able to finish the boning in one day. Then I trimmed down the edges of each layer, staggering them. I made a clip at each point in the waistline before trimming. I don't want to cut down the edges around the tabs until the last minute before I bind them. Now I just need to whip stitch all of the edges down before I start sewing them together. In the original stays, there was a tiny line of stitching to either side of the bust opening at the front. I'm not sure exactly what that was for, but I'm guessing it's just to hold the fold down nice and flat, so I'm going to replicate that now with a spaced backstitch.
But it is now December 22nd, and I really want to finish this set of stays before the year is out. And I am more than halfway done with whip stitching the pieces together, but there is still quite a lot of work left. But lately I have been focusing on this whip stitching section, which took me a little while to figure it out. So my stitching on these stays started out a little bit ridiculous, because I didn't know how to hold the pieces together. I was really skeptical about the whole idea of, I can't tie the stupid knot. I was really skeptical about the whole idea of whip stitching them together because it didn't seem very strong to me, but as I have been doing it, I can see how, if you do it correctly, you are doubling the layers that the thread is going through. Another thing that I have learned is that the whip stitching that I did when I was folding the pieces over originally, I was way too aggressive with. I whip stitched it ridiculously tight, and that was because I wanted a really hard edge to sew the pieces together with. But the problem with that is that it's pulled so far over that it actually kind of creates a bubble in the top layer, which is a little bit amazing that it's that strong. As I am going along sewing the pieces together, after they are stitched, I am going and taking out that original whip stitching, and later I will probably go back and whip stitch it down again. These are all my threads from when I took out the whip stitching. The lucky thing is you can kind of reuse them. Okay, they are all sewn together. I think the next step should be to go ahead and do the eyelets first. Am I getting that wrong? Roughly 10 inches. Oh, I'm confused. A little bit past, no, I shouldn't do that. Or this is not gonna work. Because I shortened the waist, I can't just follow the original eyelet placement, but I will spare you the numerous failed attempts I've now made trying to fumble through these calculations. Instead, here is my historically approved no math method for spacing spiral lace eyelets. First, you need paper. Just a strip, any kind. Mark the paper where your top and bottom eyelets should go. Add a bit extra, around ½ an inch or an inch, I just eyeballed it. Cut the paper to that length and fold it in half. Now there are 2 layers. Fold it again. Now there's 4. Again, and now there's 8. Again, now there's 16. Firmly crease the folds of the paper and then unfold it. Now, counting the ends, you have 17 evenly spaced lines. Tear off one segment, now you have 16. Pin the paper to your stays and mark each of the 16 fold lines with a pin on both sides. Then remove every other pin so that you have alternating pins on each side and an extra pin at the top of one side and an extra pin at the bottom of the other side.
And I ended up with 9 eyelets on each side instead of 10. Since I took an inch out of the waist, that sounds about right to me. Okay, so yesterday I finished the eyelets, and then last night I started sewing down this trim tape over the edges, and I've actually discovered there is more than one function to this tape. One, it is decorative, but two, it hides these big whip stitches, which it actually has a bit of a function in that the larger stitches are, the more prone they will be to snagging on something. So it actually protects them from that and from friction. So it is more than just decorative, it's also quite functional. However, I am having trouble with getting it to sit flat. I keep having to take it out and try it again. It was easy on this middle section, it was easy on this flat section, but when I get to these three curved seams that are kind of bubbling up and around the seam, it's either too tight, and then when I stretch the seam out, it's kind of pulling, or it's too loose and it's bubbling. So I am having a hard time figuring that out. The method that ended up working best for the tape was to stitch it down first in the center. The original tape was more narrow and had a central braid that the stitching ran on either side of, so it didn't have as much of a problem with this. My tape is plain and 1/4 inch wide, too wide to neatly stretch over the seams. I measured the tape for each seam and overcut it by a few inches. Then, just to help keep my stitches even, I marked every 1/4 inch along the length of the tape. I stitched it down first through the center of the whip-stitched seam, and then I went back and tacked the edges down in a zigzag pattern. Using this method allowed the tape to lay curved into the seam, and then stretch out with the seam when worn. Once I finished stitching down the tapes, I took the bottom ends and tucked them between the tabs, pulled them tight, and stitched them down. I need to trim down my top edge before I can secure the upper ends. I decided to follow the original pattern for the back and underarms, but I'm extending the peaks and the front a bit to make up for the short waist proportions. For the reinforcement strips, I'm going to use the linen canvas again. And I'm not trying to make the reinforcements match up 100% to the original pattern. I think it's more important to try and make sure the grain line follows the horizontal bust line.
I am going to attempt to make the busk, and I have access to all kinds of metalworking tools. Not really much in the way of woodworking tools, and only a very mediocre understanding of how they work. This is oak. It is 3/4 inch thick and 1.5 inches wide. I don't even know. We're just gonna try it, see what works.
Can't ever seem to get this thing to cut straight.
That one wasn't so bad. This has probably been very upsetting for any actual woodworkers out there to watch, but here we go. This is shaping up pretty nicely. Now I have to start kind of sloping it up to make this more of a true point and less of a Barbie kayak. That's not too bad. I am pleasantly surprised.
Now that the busk is ready, I need to finish all of the reinforcement pieces so I can actually put it in. I'm going to start by making a small triangular placket to set behind the bust opening. I whip-stitched it down first around the edges, leaving the excess free to bubble up in the middle, but this didn't seem very strong. I think the placket is actually supposed to be stitched tightly down, with the row of stitches along the eyelets. I didn't bother to seam rip the old stitches, I just sewed right atop them, matching each stitch for stitch. I'm going to go ahead and start binding the top edge because looking at these raw edges is kind of stressing me out. So Here is what I managed to complete this evening. Top edge binding, I stitched it all the way across the front edge, and then I'm only about halfway done with tacking it down on the inside. The center panel, I do not know how the original was done. I don't think this is how it was done, but I'm pretty happy with it. I just sewed this inset panel in flush with the top edge, and then I sewed the binding straight across the edge, and when it folds closed, it lays nice and flat. Anyways, good night.
With only 3 days left to go, I first need to finish off this upper edge binding. The next complicated thing I've been avoiding is the reinforcement strip that runs along the base of the splits. I'm not sure how this is going to work, but I'm going to start by cutting a straight strip of canvas and ironing over a small fold, so that the reinforcement begins without a raw edge. I pinned the lower edge down first, trying to line up the fold with the top of each split. And I might adjust how far I cut the splits up so that each hit the reinforcement strip at the same place. This is very weird and wonky, and I don't know how well the top edge will smooth to match. I whip stitched the strip down, folding it over my table so I could get at a flat edge. That worked pretty well, but folding it over the edge of the table caused the tension to build up in the exact opposite direction of how it will be worn, so I unstitched the outer half and tried again. I did eventually figure out how it needed to be sewn. I had to fold the stays into their final position and basically sew blind, feeling the underside to make sure everything was lined up and the needle was in the right place. This actually worked really well, but part of that is down to the shifty nature of the linen canvas. I don't think it would have gone as smoothly if I had used anything else.
I wish I had a before and after, because it is really incredible how much shaping just those two pieces on the inside added. Beforehand, this would have just been laying flat. Now look at it, it's 3D.
Next, I need to sew on the 3 belly piece layers. I cut the belly piece layers from linen scraps, left over from other parts of the project. Then I just whip stitched each layer on individually. To secure the busk, the book only mentions 1 layer, but I really can't figure out how that's supposed to work in conjunction with the bust split. So I'm going to use 2 layers, and sew the busk between them first. To secure the busk piece, I centered it over the front of the stays. I whip stitched them down just like the other belly piece layers, but I left the top half loose, so that the bust split could shift freely above it. I also tacked down the center of the open placket to the peak of the busk piece, just to try and keep it even. It's not very strong, but I'm hoping it doesn't have to be. Now I can finally start trimming and splitting the tabs, and stitching the binding on. And stitching the binding on took literally all day. To line the tabs, I took small scraps of linen and placed them over each tab. I traced them roughly around the edges, trimmed them down, and ironed the edges over. Then each tab individually could be pinned in place and sewn down. I left the tops of the tabs long and raw, as they will be covered by the body lining, except the center back tabs. For those I folded over and secured the tops. To line the main body, I drew on seam placements at the sides. Then I laid a bigger piece of linen over top and traced it too. I did need to remember to go back and add extra to the center to make room for the bust split. I ironed it as well, pinned it in place, and stitched it down, leaving the sides open so I could slip the back lining pieces underneath.
Okay. That's left. I have such a headache.
And there you go, 6:47. Oh wow, does my head hurt. And everything else. Okay, it is now after New Year's and I've had a day to recuperate. I feel like by the end of that project, I was slowly, physically and mentally deteriorating. I did wear the stays to a New Year's party, but by 9 o'clock I had such a raging headache that I just left and went home and went straight to sleep in my shift. The sewing is complete, but there is one more thing to do. I need to douse the stays in water to get rid of all of the blue markings. And I'm actually going to let them soak longer, because I had an idea to wear them while they're still wet to see if the reeds conform better to my shape. See, look, I let them hang up to dry, and the damp is now centered perfectly on the waist and tabs. And now, may I present the stays. Okay, so final thoughts. Sometimes I find it useful to treat my relentlessly howling inner critic like a really mean kindergartner. So I will only allow myself to critique 3 things that I wish I'd done differently, and in return I must also admit 3 things that I actually like. Okay, first, bad thing. Sometimes I play a game with myself called Clever or Dumb, and it's when I have an idea and I'm like, this is really clever, I can't believe nobody else has thought of this before. And sewing with linen thread in the sewing machine was a dumb idea. I had to go ridiculously slow to try and keep it from skipping stitches, and it still skipped. And the burrs in the thread every once in a while would snap, and so I would have to stop progress and start over. And it was so unnecessary. I could have just used a regular polyester linen colored thread. The whole process would have actually been a lot more fun because I could have just gone zip, 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 instead of having to inch my way through sewing these things. Don't use the linen thread of the sewing machine. I have checked, it's not a good idea. Okay, first good thing. I love the Busk. It just happened that when I was buying supplies from Burnley and Trowbridge, they were out of Busks at the time, so I didn't get one. And then later on, it was like, should I really pay 15 to 20 bucks to order what is essentially a sanded piece of wood? I'm sure I could make that. And then with this particular stay design, it had that really weird kind of angled busk. So I kind of went into it with I don't know if I can make this, but I'm gonna try to make it, and worst case scenario, I can just use strip of wood. It actually worked really, really well. It's not perfect, but I'm so flippin' proud of myself. The stays have that shape, and it could not have come from anything else. I'm happy with that one. Okay, second bad thing. I realized after I had finished them that I put the decorative tape on in the wrong order. I was pretty sure based off of the pictures that the tape was supposed to go on later, but I didn't know why, and I kind of just wanted to do it, so I did it. But I actually figured out why it goes on last. And that is, if you put it on last, then when it is pulled tight around the splits of the boning channels, it actually tightens and wedges the binding up instead of the binding having to cling to it. So that's just a little thing, but I was just like, oh, that would have been so easy to just reverse order, and it would have given it one more little function. So whatever, now you know. Okay, second good thing. So also playing the is it clever or is it dumb game, I decided to wear the stays while wet and try to mold them to my shape. That worked really well, crazy well. You see the very subtle lines and curvature of these stays. They did not have that. It was like an instant break-in process. It was a very, very cold thing to do this lovely January. But the first time I put them on, they were very uncomfortable. But if you think about it, at that point in time, all of the reeds are straight. They're trying to stay straight, even though I am trying to bend them as I wear them. So all of these tabs are trying to straighten themselves on my hips, which was just causing a lot more extra pressure. When I wore them wet, the whole thing just took my shape so much better. I really can't even begin to describe how much of a difference that made in the actual end result. And the third biggest regret I have is just the kind of loose stitching on the binding on the bottom edge around the tabs. I don't think that there was any technique problem. I think that I was just in too big of a hurry. And you know, it doesn't look as bad as it did. I feel like when I soaked it, everything about the stays just kind of tightened up a little bit, but it's just something else that I could improve on next time. And then the final thing that I really love about these stays is a very arbitrary thing, and that is I really, really love my color palette. I'd never really seen the shade Madder Red before, and then when I was studying 18th century, it just keeps popping up. And it just kind of became intrinsically entwined with 18th century in my own head. The fact that it gets to be on my staple piece is very satisfying. But then I also really, really love the way the kind of rust color of the red looks against the natural linen and the white linen. And I only have 2 pieces done right now, but like when I get my petticoat and I get my rump, I want to make everything coordinate. Even though the Madder Red fabric I used was technically too light, and you can tell like it doesn't look the best up close. There's definitely some bubbling that shouldn't be there. But I just love the color so much that I don't even regret using the wrong fabric. So if you have made it all the way to the end of this long video, I really want to thank you. I've been planning this for a while. These stays were kind of my baby project, and now this video is kind of my baby project, and I just wanted it to turn out really, really well and to be very, very useful to people. I want to allow the video to be long enough to give you as much guidance as it possibly can. So, you know, good luck! I feel like a drum.